Okay, I think we're ready to get going. Hopefully everybody's coming in from the waiting room. Before I make the introductions and give some context for today's webinar, let's get a bit of housekeeping done as usual. First off, apologies for the late postponement of this webinar back in February, and thanks for coming along today. So the rules are as standard. Make sure to remain muted. Hands up if you want to ask a question, or if you'd rather we kind of pose it to the panelists, then pop it in the chat. General questions at the end, so we'll do a bit of kind of Q&A at the end, covering all the topics that we've heard. We will be recording the presentation for distribution at a later date. So again, if you don't want to see yourself, do the usual. My name is Mark Dowey. I'm the Senior Development Officer for CoMoUK, specialising in the built environment. I'm an architect to trade. And I think you know what CoMoUK do in terms of promoting shared transport in Scotland and the UK generally. So a wee bit of context for today. So this forum will look at the issues raised for shared transport within NPF4 and the future challenges within this sector in a planning context. So it's about that. Why? Well, NPF4 is imminent. We all need to respond to the consultation by the end of March. There is an absolute plethora of other planning consultations sitting around it with various connections. So we've got STPR2, again, for the, I think that's for the 6th of April, 14th of April. We've got the LDP, which is sort of a regulatory framework around the NPF4, and also the 20% car kilometre reduction, which is primarily about carbon reduction in that context. All that has implications for the built environment and shared transport, a carbon context, various other things. So yeah, at the end, we'll have a Q&A session with all three speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. There will be a few Q&A between each speaker, with the speaker, perhaps myself as well, after each presentation. So let's move into introductions. First person who's graciously agreed to speak is David Wood from PAS. David is PAS's Planning and Policy Manager. Planning Advice Scotland support a planning system that is inclusive, positive and innovative, where individuals and communities help shape the future of their place. After David, we have Euan Leitch, who is the Chief Executive of SURF, the Scottish Urban Regeneration Forum. SURF's overall objective is to improve the lives and opportunities of residents in Scotland's disadvantaged communities. I will follow up as the last speaker. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, if I can, and I'll hand over to David for him. Thanks very much. I'll speak to you shortly. Hi, David.
Hi, thanks very much, Mark, for the intro. I'm just going to share my presentation.
No problem. I'll mute myself.
So good. Is that okay? Let's just do that again.
That's fine, David.
Yep, is that okay? Yep. So good morning, everybody, and thanks very much to CoMoUK and Mark for the invite to be here. I think the invite came out of a kind of discussion that Mark and I had earlier this year about a possible partnership working between the two organisations, given we've both got an interest in people and place and possibly even planning. So yeah, what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to start with a bit of planning context, because I think you need to, rather than go straight into looking at National Planning Framework 4, it's always useful to have a bit of context of where it's come from, possibly where it's going. I'll give a short overview of who PAS. We kind of tend to use the abbreviation, but Planning Aid Scotland in full. I'll give a short overview of who we are and what we do, and then I'll move into looking at National Planning Framework 4 and the sort of direction of travel, and welcome any questions or comments in the chat. So yeah, and just to say a bit about myself, I'm a chartered planner. I entered planning as a career change when I was about in my 30s, and worked in the private sector for a few years, became chartered, and then I was a volunteer with Planning Aid Scotland, and took on a full-time post about 13 or 14 years ago. So I've been around for a while, and I guess I've always been interested in the people and community engagement side of planning, but I'm also a policy person as well. That's a big part of my role. So I'm going to just start. I often use this slide in any sort of planning talk that I do, and I think it's often easy to forget, but also really important to remember. To remember where the planning system came from. Some people may be aware of this, some may not, but it was established after World War II, bringing together a bit of a lot of thinking about town planning and building in the run up to that, looking back at poor living conditions, quite competing, possibly unsuitable uses of land together in towns. So, of course, after World War II, Labour government, establishment of NHS, nationalisation, and essentially in 1947, with a big focus on health and living conditions and looking at forward planning for the future, but also being regulatory, a requirement to apply for planning permission. So essentially nationalising the right to develop land, which is quite a complex concept to think about, but essentially applying for permission rather than just doing what you want. I won't go through all of this, but really the point I'm trying to make is that the agenda and the context of the planning system has changed fairly constantly, not exactly decade by decade. This is quite simplistic in a lot of ways, but hopefully it's useful. So in the 70s, public consultation became a big thing, sustainability. And then in the last I suppose about 15 years, we've had a couple of planning acts since planning was devolved, became a devolved power to the Scottish Parliament. So 2006 Act did lots of things, but possibly most sort of importantly for today, it established the requirement for the Scottish ministers, Scottish government to produce a spatial plan for Scotland, which is called the National Planning Framework. And from our point of view, that is a PAS take. There was a big focus on community engagement. Excuse me. And then we just had another planning act a couple of years ago, and that changed quite radically the context for the national planning framework. And it also, which I'll come on to, and it focused on collaboration, and also again of interest to everyone, but particularly PAS, it set in statute the right to prepare a local place plan. That's a community's plan for their own place, which I may touch on again. So that's where this topic, the focus of today, National Planning Framework 4, has come from. Prior to 2006, there was elements of regional planning in Scotland, but there was not a national plan looking at Scotland as a whole. So you can maybe see where that came from politically as well as spatially. So again, just as a bit of context, I won't read through all of these, but there are a lot of stakeholders in the planning system, which makes it complex and interesting and challenging. I've put in blue, who I guess I thought is probably quite important from a CoMoUK point of view. I mean, regional, I'm not expert in regional transport partnerships, but Cestran is the one for the south area of Scotland where I live, Edinburgh, and it produces its own strategy and looks at assisting planning for planning projects. The Parliament approves the legislation which the Scottish Government writes. Community councils, I don't know whether we have community representatives today. Community councils are the only group with a statutory role in planning. And of course, local authorities, including the national parks as planning authorities, kind of make the planning system happen, and not forgetting developers and applicants. And I think government, other organisations are always have the UN Sustainable Development Goals in mind, which I'm guessing a lot of people here will know about, but of course they talk about healthy, sustainable cities, which feels relevant to CoMoUK. And National Transport Strategy, I won't dwell on this, I'm not a transport planner, but it promotes active travel, and the Transport Scotland have set out a vision for the next 20 years in their current transport strategy. More widely, and again, I think relevant to CoMoUK planning, shared mobility hubs, is the place principle. That is essentially, it's quite difficult to get your head around in some ways, but it's essentially a government approach, possibly even a policy about agencies working together to improve places and with local communities. And that followed on from the Christie Commission report saying that a lot of silo working existed in organisations in Scotland, and that communities did not necessarily have a voice, you know, in the delivery and provision of services in their place. So again, that felt relevant. And linked to that, if there's planners in the room, you'll know that planning and placemaking get talked about alongside each other these days. So that's just a quick reference to what the government views in policy terms. It will be, a version of this will be is in the draft NPF4, but again, resource efficient, adaptable, easy to move around and beyond, feels very relevant to the role of CoMoUK. So yeah, okay. And then just to finish off really in context, place standard, a lot of you may be aware of that. It's become quite an integral part of planning, placemaking in Scotland, particularly from a local authority, community engagement perspective. So this is a document prepared by NHS Scotland and Scottish Government in 2015, really aimed around helping people, communities, groups of people to have a structured conversation around place. Again, it felt relevant as context for today's talk. And how it works is, you know, you can facilitate a structured discussion around these 16, I think, themes. So obviously there's ones that are really relevant to sustainable transport, and the community can score as high or as low, and you can obviously compare this between different areas in your area you're working in, or different groups' views on the same area. And just finally, how this is really trying to indicate, again, I use this slide with different groups, but it's trying to just looking at how planning is expressed at local authority level, and this is going to be relevant again to as I move on. So every local authority planning department will have a development planning team, and they're responsible essentially for producing what is called a local place plan. So there's 34 local place plans in Scotland. Sorry, I'll start again. They're responsible for producing a local development plan, and that is the main planning document for every local authority, area and national park in Scotland. And essentially that it sets out future land uses. If somebody wants land to change to be used for a car park or housing, school, that can be put through that process and assessed. And every local development plan currently in Scotland has a set of policies which the local authority planners have written themselves, obviously looking at Scottish Government guidance, and those policies are assessed, are used to as the primary source to assess planning applications, and that's what the jargon development management is the planning application side of local authorities. So a big part of local authority role in planning is taking a decision on planning applications based on the relevant policies, and also other considerations which are called material considerations in planning. So it's quite a discretionary system. We have planning decision makers have to balance up the policy against other relevant decisions. Enforcement, as you can guess, is when people have done something without planning permission, but we won't be touching on that today. So that was a bit of scene setting, and I will just move on to say a bit about who we are as an organisation. So we've been working up our mission statement and vision at the moment, so I thought I would trial run it today. So I think what we're saying at the moment is we're here to help people navigate the planning system and shape the future of their places. We've been around as a national charity since the 90s, but planning aid services appeared all over the UK in the late 60s, 70s, kind of in reaction, probably in reaction to kind of quite comprehensive redevelopments, you know, big housing schemes, roads, developments, motorways, which possibly communities, probably a lot of the feeling was communities had not always had a voice in that, right up to the building of new towns like Cumbernauld, Glenrothes, Stevenage, etc. So yeah, that's where we came from, and I think we started off with about half a day of paid staff time. There's now 8 of us in total. So we're impartial. I'm not going to read all this out, but crucially, we're impartial in all the work that we do, which a lot of people appreciate, and sometimes people don't appreciate that because it means we can't campaign in the way that other organisations do. We're not a membership organisation, which is important to say. Again, people often don't realise that. So we don't represent community groups, but we are individuals, but we certainly try and help them with planning in a range of ways. We're also a social enterprise, so we're not just dependent on government funding. A lot of the work we do, we go out and pitch for or tender for or get in partnership with other organisations. And it's volunteer-led. It's a volunteer-based organisation. We have about 300 or 400 volunteers who are mainly planners who always help deliver our services. And I think the inclusive thing is we're very aware that a lot of people don't have a voice in planning. It's quite an abstract concept for a lot of people. So we do a lot of work with young people, and we've done work with the Gypsy Traveller community, who are identified as an excluded group. So in terms of, a bit more quickly, in terms of what we actually do, I'm focusing just on a few things. We provide a free planning advice service for members of the public and community groups. That was our original service, and we get like 1.5k inquiries a year, and might be a volunteer, it might be myself or a colleague, but always a chartered planner giving impartial advice. But the vision at the start was always of Planning Aid Scotland was always to move away from being reactive, which is what the advice service is. Although we do get communities contacting us on it, we want to know about doing community-led plans. But I mean, the vision was always to get communities and individuals more upskilled so they have the knowledge to get involved in planning. Hence, we run quite an extensive training program for members of the, mainly for community councils and elected members, also training events for our volunteers, and that is often focused on understanding the planning system, building on some of what I was looking at beforehand. We also do community engagement, public speaking, facilitation, training in using the place standard, using online engagement and more. And then in the last 7 or 8 years, I think really the big focus of our work has been on community-led plans. We've done numerous iterations of this sort of thing, which hopefully the pictures tell their own story. But this was a fairly high profile project in Applecross with big housing shortage. So it was focused on being quite spatial and quite planning rather than just words about what people would like. We actually mapped out with the community and the relevant stakeholders potential sites and this kind of thing where new homes could go. But of course, lots of other things always emerge in this sort of plan. So walking routes, active travel, sustainable tourism came out as a big issue. And subsequently, they're progressing with various housing sites, and I think have, you know, e-bikes, you know, which not everyone agrees with, but it did have outputs. And just pulled this out. It was another, I think, Stromness. We've obviously done a lot of work with children, young people, which we always do on this community-led plan. And it was obviously quite based around sustainable travel. So, okay, and we also, a big part of my job, we respond to Scottish Government consultations and planning from a community engagement and user perspective. Okay, so that's hopefully set the scene for moving into the main topic of today, which is to look at the National Planning Framework 4. Again, what I'm going to do is I mean, I don't know whether everyone in the audience has read it from cover to cover or flicked through it. So again, I'm treating this as a bit of scene setting, a bit of commentary, and a bit of opinions from me, with a focus on the CoMoUK remit. So yeah, the 2019 Planning Act set out, it really it's changed the status and focus of national planning framework. So National Planning Framework 4 is going to be a lot more important than I would say than the previous iterations, which maybe local authorities looked at but didn't necessarily have. You know, they did have impact, but they were maybe not the key planning document, because that remained the local development plan. So why, in my view, it's going to be so important for everyone, planners, communities, stakeholder groups, is I would say primarily it will contain a suite of national planning policies, of which about 58 are laid out in draft NPF4. So it will, and the Act stipulates that the NPF4 will be part of the, I should actually say development plan. It's a generic term rather than local development plan. But basically at Falkirk Council level, they will not be expected to rewrite the policies of the National Planning Framework 4 in their own local development plan. Excuse me. So that may end up being a slimmer document, more based on setting out sites, what should be happening where, and town centres, than having lots of policies. Although they are very much allowed to write their own policies and guidance if they feel they need to. Excuse me, just have a quick drink. It's, allocation of land for housing, new homes has been a controversial issue in planning over the last 7 and 8 years. So the government, I would say, is trying to take, a more standard approach and ownership over that by setting targets for new homes, region by region, local authority by local authority. And I think, there's emerging new thinking about planning, probably continuing that, thinking back to my context slide, the first slide. Thinking's evolving about what planning is and what it's for, not just in the post-pandemic situation, because a lot of that thinking was there before. So you will see, obviously there is a continuing policy in sustainable travel. That was, all these government level policies were previously expressed in a document called Scottish Planning Policy, which will cease to exist once NPF4 is adopted. But there was a policy in sustainable travel in the soon to be defunct Scottish Planning Policy, but new policy thinking can be seen to be coming through in the draft NPF4. So looking at climate emergency, things like community wealth building, policy on the circular economy, policy on human rights, as government sees that could be delivered and expressed through planning. And just flick back, I mean, the Act, if you look at what the Act says, these are all, I won't read all these out, but these are aims that the NPF, or outcomes, I should say, that NPF4 must show, how it contributes to. So I was just thinking last night, of course, that probably has point D, for example, has led to the appearance of the policy on human rights. And again, point B just strikes me as very, very pertinent and relevant to CoMoUK and the audience here today. And you can see in the blue text, big focus on climate change. So what this means, this is a moving forward diagram from Scottish Government here. If you're interested in planning in your local area, what you have to know about will be the National Planning Framework plus the local development plan. They generically will be called the development plan, which is a really annoying sort of terminology thing in planning, but we call whatever the statutory plans are referred to generally as the development plan. And key message, and NPF4 is going to be super important. Just for awareness, alongside that, there's a non-statutory regional level of planning that will exist, regional spatial strategies. Local authorities can collaborate to draw that up themselves. It's an emerging picture, and really, I mean, in some ways, to me, it's the biggest intervention in the planning system in a long time. Statutory right for communities to prepare their own plan for their place, called a local place plan, which I will touch on again as the presentation progresses. So just this is what's in NPF4 if you've not looked at it already, and I'll move through some of these. But part 1, National Spatial Strategy for Scotland, looking at Scotland as a whole. Part 2 is national developments. It's quite important. That's about 18 development concepts that government feels is crucial for Scotland's development, and they essentially have approval in principle through being in, if they make it into the final adopted NPF4. And then there's the National Planning Policy Handbook, as the government calls it, and then a shorter section on delivery, and then various annexes on how they meet those outcomes, a section on housing numbers and glossary. And I'll start slightly flying through these, but the National Spatial Strategy, as I said, has various elements, but I mean, don't necessarily find that text in blue that helpful, but that's what's said. It's about a shared vision. They give a diagram showing key connections in Scotland around strategic connections, maritime routes, cities, ports, transmission, you know, power lines. And then what the government has done in the spatial, or has proposed in the spatial strategy, is a way of looking at Scotland as a whole, excuse me, but dividing it into 5 sort of thematic areas. So we are in the central urban transformation area. Well, I'm in the central Edinburgh transformation area at the moment in Edinburgh, but that in fact stretches really from just south of, I think, Dundee down to the Ayrshires. So it's a very wide way of looking at Scotland. And they've kind of pulled out some key priorities. There's several pages on each of these areas, which you can read if you want. But for example, Northeast is very much focused on moving from reliance on the oil and gas industries. How's that going to happen? Central urban transformation looks a lot more at town centres, how we're going to handle those, which I think Euan will touch on, will you be looking at, so I won't say too much about that. And obviously there's different challenges in different areas of Scotland. Sort of, again, in the spatial strategy, and this follows forward into the policies, 4 themes around, I guess, what we want Scotland to be, what the government and collectively we might want Scotland to be like. So there's policies and a bit of narrative under each of these coloured themes. Okay, I think I can move on. Yeah, and this is in some ways quite important, I think, again, for today's NPF4 also sets out series of spatial principles. If you look at the document, I mean, personal opinion, it looks slightly dropped into me. I'm not quite sure how these relate. I think it could be worked up a lot more in the document. I think they're really important. We've been running, I should say, a series of public events for the Scottish Government about NPF4. So there has been a bit of comment about how do the different sections relate to each other and knit together. But all these spatial principles underpin everything, I would say, in NPF4, even if I'm not sure how well that's explained. You know, local living, I guess you're going to talk about that from a SURF perspective. Just transition, you know, moving away from more carbon dependent ways of living to more sustainable ways of living, balanced development. I mean, to me, most of these relate to the work of CoMoUK. And then just, I won't really read these out, but that's the 18 national development proposals, ranging from site specific. So Dundee Waterfront's a continuation, but Aberdeen Harbour has I think it's a new one. Sorry, these are a bit blurred screenshot. Clyde Mission's really interesting to me as somebody who really likes Glasgow, like really trying to, lots of local authorities I think would be working to try and make the Clyde better place in planning and placemaking terms. The one I looked at caught my eye with regard to today was a new one which has appeared. I've marked yellow. It's like National Development 5, circular economy. I can't read, just going to move my toolbar so I can read it. Circular economy, materials facilities. Now, management facilities. Now that it's not necessarily that well sketched out, because the government say they still need to do more work to decide what's needed. But essentially they're saying moving away from waste and having recycling facilities that are based on reusing rather than just getting rid of stuff. So I guess my thought process was, you know, if that can be a national development, why couldn't shared mobility hubs? I'm not saying they're on the same scale, but maybe it's something to think about. And I'm sure Zero Waste Scotland will have done a lot of work, you know, to discuss with government that why this would be a good idea. So I thought I'd flag that up within the context of the national developments. Because they do consult, you know, all these national developments have been proposed, like the Clyde mission, don't think was the government's idea, it probably came from a consortia of local authorities. Sorry, can't move my slide, okay. Right, so here's all the policies. There's a lot of policies. These are all being consulted on at the moment. I've marked yellow ones that I think have got some relevance, at least to the work of CoMoUK. But I mean, you could probably put a lot more yellow on there because probably it relates to if you're building new housing developments, you know, transport, having good transport links is really important. So just move on, just to give you an idea of what a couple of these policies look like. So this is really the key policy 2, it's key focus of NPF4, climate emergency. It's just an extract, but when considering all development proposals, local authorities should give significant weight to the climate emergency. So discussion point, what does significant weight mean? Is it, will that be robust enough? If you're, I'm sure if you, I was looking at a planning application for a shared mobility hub in Alloa last night, and of course it was cross-referenced to the policies in the local development plan, but I'm sure it would have been probably been seen to meet this policy. And likewise, if it's at the point C, if there's significant emissions, it probably shouldn't be refused. And then here's a new policy. I mean, that is, interestingly, that's the full policy. There's not that much that is said about community wealth building. So whether that relates directly, I mean, community wealth building, it's trying to move away, I guess, from the current economic model to a more community focused, sustainable model. I'm not sure that there's a lot of academic and policy stuff out there about it, but that's all there is in the policy 2 points. I think a lot of planners are thinking, what do we do with this? Could we use this to determine planning applications or refuse planning applications? And if you're a developer, are you expected to demonstrate that you meet this policy? So I'm just trying to, like, hopefully I'm trying to enliven what the document is and what it's going to mean. And then here's, I mean, Mark, maybe you're going to touch on this, so I won't spend too long, but there's a policy on sustainable travel. It's just extracts I've got. So the planning system should support development that minimises the need to walk, to travel unsustainably, and prioritises walking, wheeling, cycling, public transport, shared transport options. So not particularly controversial in my opinion, and probably a continuation of where we've come from and the work that yourselves and Sustrans and others are doing around active travel. And again, just, of course, you need to be able to use the policies to refuse applications and justify your decision. So that's what points G and H are looking at. It's a longer policy. There's quite a bit of info there, not as long as the circular economy one, which goes on over 2 pages. So just sort of, I'm now moving towards the end of what I've got to say. This is the process. We used this in our public events. I decided to reuse it. So, I mean, of course, it's not come out of nowhere. There's been 2 significant consultation processes already, call for ideas and a position statement, and I'd imagine years of work before that from Scottish Government Planning and Architecture Division to reach that stage. And we're currently in the emboldened stage. public consultation on the draft, and then it's also being laid before Parliament and being looked at by committees for taking oral evidence. There'll be an analysis of responses after the closing date for consultations, which is 31st March. And then, I mean, the thinking is, as I understand it, it will be approved and adopted subject to full parliamentary debate summer 22. So we'll see what happens with that. And, you know, I'm a policy person. I would say it's always important. It's really important to respond, even if there's only one question out of the forgotten, I mean, 60, 70 questions that you want to respond to. And as somebody in the Scottish Government said to us, it could just be the one thing you say triggers a change in direction of their thinking. And there's a good online system to make your responses. So just rounding up, these are my thoughts, not necessarily organisational thoughts, and maybe to set the thinking for the rest of today. So how will the spatial policy ambitions of NPF4 be delivered by planners? It is very ambitious, but will the policies and the strategy make that happen? Will the policies influence development proposals? Will they allow confident planning decisions? Is the wording strong enough? Does there, excuse me, sorry. At the moment, there isn't a prioritisation of policies, although the first suite, sustainable development, is also referred to as universal policies and has stuff on climate change. So there's a mini sub-debate going on in the planning sphere about should the climate change policy override the listed buildings policy, but that is not how planning works. In every case, it's a case by case. And if you're a planning case officer, you have to balance up which policies should have the most weight, or should other considerations even overweight the policies. Fourth point, I couldn't think how to express it, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it actually enough that we're just creating this new planning landscape and the policies will develop over time and be tested? And from our point of view, the role of local place plans to express NPF4 ambitions at local level. We're doing a second round of quite a big project with Paths for All funding to help communities prepare prepare sustainable transport plans, not doing it all for them, but actually training and upskilling them to do it themselves. So, and final point, are you going to respond to NPF4? And I decided to put this back in, but I won't dwell on it. That's a slide I've used for local place plans previously. And I think that could be a really interesting way for communities who are interested in active travel to express their aspirations for their place. It's going to be a key area of focus for PAS. So yeah, that's me finished. So thank you very much. I will on-screen share, but that's my contact details, and drop me an email if there's anything you'd like to follow up on.
That was a wonderful, wonderful overview. Thank you very much, David. It's such a large body of work, NPF4, that it's really difficult to bore down into what's important in it. But I think you've done that very, very well. So thanks for that. There's a few things that really grabbed me. I'll not dwell too long, but I think it was interesting you made the point about the sustainability agenda coming in the 1990s. I think that also feeds into COP26 as well. I kept saying to my kids around COP26, don't get too excited. We've been doing this 25 times. This is the 26th go at it. So, I mean, I just, do you feel that NPF4 goes far enough, that whole idea of radical change, you know, in the context of the Climate Change Commission giving the Scottish Government a bit of a slap in the wrist yesterday, that their policies are not going far enough in terms of climate change? I mean, what's your feeling on that?
Right. Yeah, I didn't see the, yeah. Am I on mute? No, sorry. I didn't see the thing you referred to, Mark, yesterday, so I won't comment on that directly. I think, we are a part-funded Scottish Government organisation. I guess we try and be a helpful guiding friend to them. I think it's not that we can't disagree, and I've expressed some opinions already. I think certainly the Scottish Government see this as a radical shift, and I think having policy 2 with climate change in it is significant. I think for me, the question still remains how are these policies going to be used? And I'm not sure the government will get it exactly right this time. You tend to find in planning new concepts. And I'll give an example of short-term holiday lets in Edinburgh. At the moment, other areas of Scotland, it's a hot issue for how people experience planning on the street, if you like, which we get a lot of at PAS through our advice service. But you know, that has those decisions around should that tenement in the Grassmarket be allowed to be used as a Airbnb. That's been tested at planning appeal and actually in the courts, and that's where the precedents get set. And I think that might happen with local place plans. You know, if a community, I think that will have to be tested as well because they're not part of the local development plan. I mean, so I honestly don't know. And you know, we're actually, I mean, our role is about explaining the system to people. So I mean, there has been a bit of discussion, you know, how will communities use these policies? You know, I see the question in the chat from Laura, but as well around communities, slightly different area. But, you know, I mean, there has been discussion, well, from local authorities, well, active community groups try and use the human rights policy to stop development. And if the policy is there, they've absolutely got the right to do that. I just think, yeah, I think there's been a debate in terms of the strength of the policies around the wording, should and must, you know, and there's quite a few. I think the government will definitely end up looking at that. I think the document needs a really hard edit in a way. There's a bit too much text in it, but, you know, the government says they use must when it's a legislative requirement and should when it's a sort of policy. Yeah. Is there. But I mean, definitely, I think they've had a look at what's happened in planning at community level around the housing issue, you know, the last few years, and have tried to respond to that. So it's probably a non-answer, sorry, but
no, I mean, I think, you know, at Como, we applaud the ambition of the document. There's no two ways about it, but I think there is always concerns about the delivery mechanisms beyond the policy. I think there's you know, I'll cover it in my presentation. There's huge opportunities, there's huge challenges within NPF4, but I think the direction of travel generally is very positive. Could they go further? They can always go further. There's no two ways about that. But I think, you know, it's always interesting to hear different viewpoints from different camps, if you like.
And some of the things I've said are things other people have said to me. You know, I mean, we've got environmental written into our charity articles, and we, of course, therefore massively support policy, inclusion of policy to nature crisis, and probably the human rights policy as well. You know, I mean, definitely that having that featuring in some way in NPF4.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that. I'm very conscious of time and we'll probably need to move on. What last point I would like to make is you made mention of the place standards toolkit, which we think is an excellent piece of work in terms of assessing community need around planning. What we've done is in the Shared Transport Knowledge Centre, which we've published online, is we've put some additional questions around shared transport. I mean, I'm not going to go into the whys and wherefores of how place standards toolkit works. But what I would say is to communities, if you're interested in shared transport and you're using the place standard toolkits, then we've got an addendum to it that will allow you to assess shared transport opportunities in your community. That's just there. Thanks very much.
I should have said, Mark, there's a second version of place standard is due to come out fairly soon. I think that might have more of a focus on climate change. But yeah, thank you very much.
Indeed. Yeah, thanks very much for your time on that, and we'll let Euan come in and do his thing. So thanks, David, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. Man of a certain age wearing a blue top seems popular. So my name is Euan Leitch. I'm the Chief Executive of SURF, the Scotland's Regeneration Forum, and we have a focus on what holistic regeneration is. We've existed for over 20 years, and we look at regeneration being the social, economic, physical and cultural change within a place, and that it's important that the intended beneficiaries of any regeneration are in the driving seat so that they are there for the planning, implementation and management of any regeneration. And our interests really lie around that virtuous circle of policy and practice, so that both inform and support one another. So our focus is around areas that are experiencing deprivation. And so it's with that kind of lens that I'm going to talk to you about NPF4 this morning. I don't have a presentation because David has given a great presentation giving the overarching things around NPF4, and I didn't want to give you any more text to look at. As has been said, the vision and aspiration of NPF4, lovely. As many strategic documents or frameworks begin, yes, the aspirations around climate change, etc., inequalities, sounds good. What does it really mean in practice when you get into the policy level, though, is maybe a slightly different answer to that. In looking at it from a poverty lens, there is a really strong focus on fuel poverty. And a lot of the answers that are kind of being pitched within the sort of visionary side of draft NPF4 are looking at micro-regeneration of fuel, and around district heating systems, which are kind of good ideas, but I suppose they also reflect the nature of planning, is that planning is responsive to landowners, developers coming forward with proposals, be that private sector or public sector, and the planning system controls or guides what that development looks like and how it functions. So that's where the renewable aspect comes into that, and it doesn't really deal with the existing environment as it sits. And I suppose when it comes to fuel poverty, one of the main issues in Scotland is the poor insulation across a lot of our housing stock, particularly in our private rented sector, but also in the private sector. And retrofit of these buildings is the solution to that. And that's obviously not something that the planning system has full control of. And a lot of my old job was in the Built Environment Forum Scotland around our existing building stock. And I suppose my colleagues around that are all very interested in how we're going to retrofit that. Planning system doesn't really have much to say on that, because you don't need planning consent to do a lot of retrofit activity. We'll need planning consent to do some retrofit and some renewables. David referred to listed buildings and conservation areas, and there is a certain debate to be had there around how we retrofit those areas and still respect character and historic character of those places. But it kind of, I would like it to do more for retrofit, but I appreciate that's maybe a building standards and a wider Scottish Government agenda around how we deliver what is a very expensive project in making our homes more fuel efficient. As I've said, planning is responsive. So high planning activity tends to take place in places where the market is hot. It's private led. A lot of what we're looking at within NPF4 will be carried out by the private sector. So the southeast of Scotland is currently, the market is hot here. There is a need for housing. There is a high demand. With the demand for housing, there becomes demand for other services, other bits of infrastructure and other bits of social infrastructure, which are partially funded through some of that active development taking place. Poorer parts of Scotland are experiencing potential market failure. There maybe is not a high demand for additional housing, so you don't have large-scale private sector development taking place there, bringing additional money into an area. And I suppose that's something that I would think is a bit of a failure within NPF4 as to how do we deal with those areas? How does our spatial framework deal with that? How does it improve the economy of those areas? There are obviously economic elements to NPF4 in terms of guiding things or regenerating certain sites, Edinburgh Waterfront, Clyde Mission, Aberdeen Harbour. But is it enough to make a significant difference to the poverty we experienced in Inverclyde, for instance, where there is a huge demand for housing, new housing, but there is a huge demand for the retrofit of existing housing. And so it's kind of how will NPF4 improve the how we as a nation address where market failure exists. And that comes back to a strong form of control as to what we allow to happen and where we allow that to happen. And David and I should confess, studied urban planning at the same time as each other and have talked about this a lot. The discretionary nature of our planning system means that a lot of it is up for debate. The lack of hierarchy within our planning, within draft NPF4's planning policies, means that that will continue to be a value-based judgment by a professional in a local area. And there are many pressures on planning officers to make those decisions. And a lot of planners will say that the discretionary nature of our system is what makes it a good and flexible system. The implication being that in countries that don't have a discretionary system, that there's a disaster happening. And there isn't a disaster happening elsewhere. But the discretionary system also means that people with power possibly outweigh those who don't have power, which means if you have a lot of money and a lot of consultants, you maybe have more power within the system than if you're, say, a community body who has less power within the system. There is a policy on sustainable travel, which no doubt Mark will talk about at length. And yes, it's private car bad, active travel good, which is superb. However, the one element that is of interest to us, and I suppose around the network that we work within, I should say we have a network of over 300 members of various sizes of organisations within SURF, is that sustainable travel includes access for reliable public transport. And so I suppose the public transport element is the thing that is that a misnomer? What is public transport? Because a lot of public transport in Scotland is privately owned. And I suppose you may be proposing something to happen in a settlement, but currently bus services are maybe under review, and the changes in public transport timetables over the past 2 years because of the pandemic have disproportionately affected poorer areas. People who are in low-paid work tend to be people who cannot work from home, and so have to travel to work, have to travel to their place of work. And because of the drop in demand in terms of public transport, the collapse of commuting, some public services have obviously reduced their timetables quite dramatically. I'm now travelling back and forth to Glasgow, and I used to really enjoy the fact that there was a fast train every 50 minutes. It's a minor irritation that it's now only every half hour, but that's a minor thing for me to have to address. But for people who are having to travel further, longer distances on a reduced bus service, that is becoming increasingly problematic. And that for settlements in Scotland who are of a certain size, so smaller settlements who need to be connected to larger places, and people who work in a larger settlement, that is something that is harder to guarantee because it is a privately delivered service through possibly a private bus service. So is it strong enough with an NPF4? Well, it's not strong enough because we really need to be addressing how we fund and manage public transport across Scotland, which is obviously handled through another strategy. But what I was going to talk to you mainly about this morning is 20-minute neighbourhoods, mainly because as part of our work with the Scottish Government this past year, we have hosted a 20-minute neighbourhood network of practitioners, primarily to look at what does 20-minute neighbourhood mean in a Scottish context, and how do we deliver it. 20-minute neighbourhoods concept is an old idea with a new brand. It's fundamentally good planning. It's living well locally. Can your daily needs be met within a short distance of your house, in which you can use active travel or public transport to get to, so that you're not car dependent? But it's about ease of access to necessary things for our daily lives. And it comes from a wide global discussion. Paris is looking at a 50-minute city. It's a dense city. It's the centre of Paris inside the periphery, but that is really being championed by the mayor, Anne Hidalgo there. It's a topic that is being discussed in places like Melbourne, which has also developed a suite of policies. Melbourne, low density, wide city, like suburban Scotland, really. Portland, another city that is leading on it. And what you'll notice about all these places that I've mentioned is they are cities. Scotland is the first place to try and apply the 20-minute neighbourhood at a national level across an entire country. So we've been doing some work around what does that mean. Other people, Ramble, have done some really good research around what it kind of looks like through data in Scotland, and that a lot of urban Scotland, you can deliver a 20-minute neighbourhood where people's daily needs are met. The policy as it's framed in draft NPF4 looks at a checklist of what you would expect to see in a 20-minute neighbourhood. The fact that you need education, access to education, health, food, play areas, green space. It's a bit fixed. One of the things it doesn't begin to address is the quality of experience in that 20-minute neighbourhood. And early research says that's fundamental to it, because while things may be physically be able to reach within a 20-minute walk of your front door, it doesn't mean that the experience is nice. It could be via a major trunk road. Does it have a pavement? Those sorts of questions are coming out in it. So quality of place means You need people on the ground to understand what that looks like, which is maybe where local place plans come in to inform the achievability of 20-minute neighbourhoods. But the thing that is mainly absent, I would say, in the 20-minute neighbourhood policy, thinking of our global comparators, is density. It makes no reference to density. Carlos Morenos in Paris is fundamental that you need high density living, and that's sort of Parisian high density living of 6 to 7 story apartment buildings to create the kind of capacity that uses public transport and brings services together. And in a 20-minute neighbourhood in Scotland, we're just saying, here's a bunch of checklists, but you could basically apply them to a low density neighbourhood added onto a city in Scotland. And in fact, currently, I've been looking at both the PR bump from large scale developments in the Central Belt and listening to some planning committee discussions around similar planning applications. They all describe themselves as 20-minute neighbourhoods, basically because they've got a shop and a bus stop and you can get to a primary school within 20 minutes. But they fundamentally look and feel and sound the same as all development over the past 20 to 30 years that are fundamentally car dependent. And the danger of, I think, the 20-minute neighbourhood policy as it stands is it's something that we can sort of generically ascribe to, but continue delivering the same thing. And we're not forcing a change towards a higher density form of living and restricting the continuation of everyone having a front door and living in a semi or a detached house or within a terrace, although terraces do provide a good form of higher density living. And I think if we are to be honest about the 20-minute neighbourhood as part of sustainable development, we are going to have to change that, which comes into how 20-minute neighbourhoods apply to rural Scotland. And we've done some work with Scottish Rural Action. And this is my personal feeling, we've not done a formal response on this yet, but we do have a report with SRA looking at what it means for rural Scotland. Is it doesn't apply to rural Scotland. People need their cars, people need private transport around to access facilities in rural Scotland. And in very small settlements, you're looking at settlements working together. They're not one place that everyone goes to get all their services provided, but different services can be provided in a collection of small settlements, which may not comply with 20 minutes. The other observation I'd make about the 20-minute neighbourhood is men get fixated on the 20-minute or the 400-metre distance. Women tend to have a different understanding that it's maybe a looser definition just to understand that it's as quickly as possible to get something. And 20 minutes is often viewed as the distance or time that someone is willing to have active travel to access services or facilities that they need. And transport nodes are obviously one of those things that people can access. In Paris, they're looking at providing you need to be able to live and work within 20 minutes. But lots of people will be working in professions where they do have to travel to their place of work. So it's about having a transport node so that they can travel further afield to that. But when it comes to the urban-rural split on 20-minute neighbourhoods, my feeling is that we should be talking about 20-minute neighbourhoods in a high-density way around settlements of a certain size, so definitely our towns and cities within Scotland, and that in a rural context, we should be talking more about living well locally. That requires deep understanding of how communities actually operate a network, but it would also allow a form of respect to them and enable the repopulation of those places in a way that doesn't force them to become like many cities. And that, I suppose, is one of the other questions that I'm thinking around this is our traditional form of development is that we have towns or settlements that are dense in the centre, they become lower density as they spread out. But if we're looking at creating new development, should the development that we now create always be of a higher density, particularly if they're close to transport interchanges, so that people have easier access to public transport, which would be a different form of the way our towns and settlements have developed so far, and could result in quite a different, primarily aesthetic and character around the settlements that we currently experience. But that is our current stance on 20 neighbourhood. We obviously will be producing our draft response to NPF4. I think our aim is to have a draft by the 28th of March, a little bit in advance of it, which we'll make publicly available. But we're also interested to hear from CoMoUK about where shared transport sits within all this. But I will end what I have to say there and happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much for that, Euan. That was really good, really interesting. I completely concur on the rural side of things. We've had that discussion to a certain extent, and I think the work that Artemis and Jenny did with SRA has been very important at re-looking at that and understanding that, yeah, it's whilst it's an overarching proposition, 20-minute neighbourhoods is clearly a good thing. It's how we apply it in rural areas, and the reality in everyday life. And I do like your idea that women and men look at it slightly differently, and I think that's very valid indeed. The other thing, yeah, I mean, in terms of that public transport interchange issue that you mentioned at the start, from our point of view, obviously shared transport and mobility hubs particularly really need that element of public transport to work. I'm not going to use the word crisis in Scotland. I don't think it's a crisis per se, but I think we definitely have an issue post-pandemic, and certainly the renationalisation of the railways, for instance, might go some way to address that. We'll need to wait and see how that all pans out, but fingers crossed that's a positive. I don't think we've got any new questions in the chat at the moment. Is there anybody out there want to stick their hand up or ask anything? No? Okay. Well, if you don't...
Can I, Mark, one of the things that I would add, to a degree following on from what David has said, one of the things that has been discussed by quite a number of people in circles around NPF4 is, if we're wanting to address poverty in Scotland, the NPF4 has to really be the thing that directs where public funding goes. So it's around prioritisation about how we deliver certain things. And I think that in the delivery section of NPF4 is weak. And I think it's making that much more explicit within NPF4 that for Scotland, for the Scottish Government, the prioritisation of funding to improve the lives of people who are experiencing poverty should be the thing that directs major public funding, rather than it being a sort of open bid for everyone to kind of compete for things, which sometimes means not the richest people, but the loudest people in the room can sometimes be successful in having it. And while they may need improvements within certain things within their area, there are people who are worse off than them that really are public funding should be prioritised for.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. I think one of the things that shared transport brings to the mix is that transport poverty angle, where people can start to afford to move around in that first and last mile basis without a car.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even just in the last 6 weeks, look at what's happened to the price of petrol. It's starting to price a lot of people out of the market. So I think it's incredibly important that people have alternative modes and options around how they travel, amongst many other poverty issues as well. So yeah, very, very important. Well, I don't see any more questions coming up, so thank you very much for your time on that, Euan. Unfortunately, as there's no more questions, you're going to have to listen to me now. So I will start sharing my screen and get going. Right, hoping everybody can see that. I'll move. Okay, planning opportunities around NPF4 and shared transport. So what we're going to talk about, really just the interaction of shared transport and NPF4. What are the opportunities and challenges inherent in the document? A general overview of the document, which to a certain extent I'll skate over because our previous two speakers have covered it very, very well. And then some conclusions around shared transport. So, as both speakers have mentioned, it's split into 5 kind of categories. We've got sustainable places, distinctive places, productive places, livable places, and the national spatial strategy. Sustainable places and livable places and the national spatial strategy are the 3 that I'll really hone in on because they kind of interact with shared transport particularly. So livable places, 20-minute neighbourhoods. We live, work, play and service within 20-minute travel time. So it's fundamentally about how we move around our towns and cities. It's about transport. So it's construed in the new NPF4 context as being predominantly active travel based, which is a wonderful thing, walking, cycling and wheeling. CoMoUK's argument is that in a reasonable transport mix, we need modality and ownership coming together. So there needs to be options as to how we move around. So what do we have? We have an opportunity around shared transport with mobility hubs and hublets. I'll not go into what these are. I think they should be self-describing in terms of a hub where lots of different forms of shared transport modes come together. There's a huge challenge around how we get operators involved into small towns. What's the modelling around that? How do we encourage people and companies in to provide shared transport modes? There's an opportunity around community-focused shared transport offerings in Scotland, particularly in the rural areas and the smaller towns, and we're starting to see that more and more. We've been out to see a few examples recently. There's a challenge around rural areas, particularly around the public transport offering and availability. You know, we get up to the Highlands and there's very little in terms of train services, bus services. You have to travel a distance to achieve that. So we're maybe looking at things like demand responsive transport where we have dial-a-bus type services. So moving on back to the policy side of it, sustainable places. Our future net zero nature positive places will be more resilient to the impact of climate change and support the recovery and restoration of our natural environment. I think it's important to blend development planning and transport planning to achieve some kind of holistic carbon reduction. I think one of the challenges inherent in NPF4 is that it's very much development planning based, and I understand that's the point of it, but I'm not sure the cohesion with NTS2, which is the National Transport Strategy, is actually enough within the document. There's not enough cohesion there. So it says that we need to reduce the need to travel unsustainably. And to do that, I think we need more options on the table. It's all very well sort of suggesting that we're all going to go to EVs, but the reality of it is we need less cars on the road. One of the Scottish Government initiatives is 20% car kilometre reduction. So that's a huge target by 2030. So we need different ways for people to travel around, not just jumping in the private car. I think that's incredibly important. Touch briefly on area-based solutions. David mentioned this. There's very little definitive shared transport input in it across the board. Northern Revitalisation has got some mobility hubs in the mix, so that's great. I think where it really starts to kick in is in the central urban transformation. So the central belt, Glasgow and Edinburgh, with the Edinburgh City Mobility Plan and the Glasgow Transport Strategy, both very, very positive documents, a lot of shared transport input in them, and that's fantastic. We've been involved with Granton Waterfront, Edinburgh Waterfront, and there's mobility hubs going to go into that, so that's very positive. And then in the rural strategies where we've touched on already, this idea of does 20-minute neighbourhoods work, be it in Allness or down in Stranraer. You know, there is definitely a lot of kind of work that needs to be done around the rural areas and how exactly we make 20-minute neighbourhoods work, not least in a transport context. So in terms of national developments, number 2 is the national walking, cycling and wheeling networks. Bit of housekeeping, we call them multimodal hubs in NPF4. STPR2, which is a Strategic Transport Projects Review, calls them mobility hubs. I think across the industry, we're starting to call them mobility hubs, so I really think the terminology is reasonably important. Mentioned STPR2. So STPR2, I think it's got about 50 policies or something in terms of ongoing large projects, transport projects in Scotland. I think it's very noticeable that it's front-loaded with active travel infrastructure themes as 1 to 5. Now, if you then go back into NPF4 to National Cycling and Wheeling Network, those 5 policies aren't referenced, and I think it's incredibly important that there is a backfill in that, and that NPF4 makes sure that it makes reference of those first 5 active travel infrastructure policies, because it sets the scene for planners. They understand that at a national level, we're trying to deliver this stuff. It's trying to ensure, we would like to see shared transport more enshrined in this policy, particularly bike share, e-bike share and mobility hubs, and maybe further down the line, other modes that are coming to the forefront, such as e-scooters down in England. We assume that will move through into Scotland in due course. So more of shared transport in this particular policy, it seems to fit very well. So national planning policy, policy 6, design quality and place. So that idea of the built environment and placemaking. I'll not go through the 6 qualities, you can see them there, but number 3 is well connected and easy to move around, supporting, I've put in brackets, travel networks of all scales. It needn't just be travel networks, it can be other types of networks as well. But I think it's important to understand that that's what shared transport needs to be. It's part of a scaling between public transport and other forms of transport. It allows you to move that first and last mile. And we think it's very important that that should be captured there. So policy 9, as Euan mentioned, I think David did as well, is sustainable transport. So obviously this is our bag. Kind of worrying that it's only 2 pages when 30% of greenhouse gas emissions by the transport sector in Scotland. So maybe there's not quite enough weight put on it. There's no mention of shared transport as a mode sitting alongside active travel options. The same idea again, active travel, wonderful, and we're all in support of it, but we need options around it, and shared transport is a very, very good way, particularly bike share. It's a really good way of, it's a gateway into getting on your bike. It re-engages people that are not cyclists, should I say, with the idea that they can cycle and they can move around that way. Proposals to improve hands or provide active travel infrastructure or public transport multimodal hubs. Again, delighted it's in there, but let's a bit of housekeeping, let's call them mobility hubs, and then everybody understands exactly what we're talking about. DPM tag, I've had to write this down to remember what it is, 2 seconds. It's the Development Planning and Management Transport Appraisal Guidance. It's the guidance that you will use when you're providing a large-scale planning scheme, hundreds or thousands of houses, and it assesses transport options around it and appraises them. At the moment, shared transport isn't actually in that guidance, so we really would like the Scottish Government, Transport Scotland, to step up and ensure that shared transport is captured within that, so that when you're appraising these schemes, you have a shared transport route, if you like, that we can go down and actually make it work within the context of the new development. And then the last one is very, very interesting and touches on a point Euan just made. The policy says will not support developments that require walking or cycling over 400 metres to local facilities. So that's your 20-minute neighbourhood thing again. And I think that's, I'll be very interested to see if in reality that comes to fruition, where we see all these large-scale housing estates, again, as Euan touched on, where there's very little facilities. Is that going to stop happening across the board now on the back of NPF4? So it's a little policy, it's in there, but it's very, very important in the scope of how we actually take forward this idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods. Just another thing, policy 9 is sustainable transport. We've got the sustainable transport hierarchy, which is this diagram on the left-hand side. That's in NPF4 just now. No, it's not, it's in NTS2 just now. And referenced in NPF4, and it's fine up to a point. I think it's historical, and we would like to see it move forward. This mobility pyramid on the right essentially does the same thing, but allows for shared transport modes within it as well. And we feel it's just a bit more cohesive in terms of what it's trying to describe from our point of view. Moving forward, policy 27, town centre living. Rather worryingly, there's no mention of car-free developments in this, or kind of parking levels and such like. Again, it could do more on public transport adjacency, again, what Euan touched on. We'd like to see more on things like parking and parking berms, just to understand a better way of doing it. You know, Edinburgh, Granton waterfront development, they're starting to look down these levels. They have very low parking ratio. I think it's down about 0.25. And they're also considering parking berms as well. And then going beyond that, things that shared transport can and car-free developments can bring to the mix, such as air quality and safety in our town centres and beyond. So what else is out there in terms of consultation? Well, there's a lot going on at the moment. We've just had NTS2, STPR2, as I've mentioned, the large-scale transport projects. I've mentioned 20% car kilometre reduction. So that's, we're trying to reduce the amount of car usage by 20% effectively. And there's also draft guidance on local development planning, which is, if you like, the regulatory level below the NPF4. So it's how does NPF4 in terms of policy drop down into regulatory assessment and such like. So we'll comment on all of these in due course, and we feel it's quite important to do so. Okay, so finishing up, opportunities and challenges. Well, from our point of view, one of the opportunities in NPF4 is engage with house builders. We can promote mobility hubs to local authorities because these sort of things are starting to move into the policy agenda. Build community engagement and shared transport. I'm not sure NPF4 delivers that per se, but it certainly encourages the climate as regards that. Hopefully it's an increase in shared transport provision in Scotland. That seems to be the direction of travel generally. And obviously with that, we would love to see a decrease in car usage. At the end of the day, this is to a certain extent, from our point of view, all about that, getting rid of the private car. So what are the challenges? Huge cultural challenge in Scotland around shared transport. There's no two ways about it. And we'll hope to do some work on that and find ways of getting over the hump, as you will, if you will, and moving forward to provide more shared transport out there. I've touched on it already, integrate transport and development planning. At the moment, we have two camps. Of course, they talk to each other, of course, they interact, but we'd like to see more interaction, such that we have a cohesive and holistic approach to development, in which transport is very much considered at the forefront of it. I'll go back to that 30% of greenhouse gases as a transport issue. How we move around is a huge issue in the climate emergency. Acceptance of the mobility hub concept. You know, we're starting to see a take up on it, but again, let's get it out there and get it moving. I think we need to be very clear that shared transport is not a competitor to active travel. It's complementary and it's a gateway to active travel as well. And we're really keen to make sure our partners and everybody out there understands that. We've touched on rural solutions. Does the 20-minute neighbourhood work in that context? And again, I would refer you to the Scottish Rural Action's work on this. Artemis Pana is the person to speak to. And again, the challenge is decreased car usage at the moment. Are we doing enough to do so? And I think there's certainly questions around that. I think that's me done. I'll just check. Oh no, thoughts. I've got a bit more. I think overall NPF4 is a strong piece of legislation. I touched on that earlier. Does it go far enough? Yeah, I think you can argue nothing ever does, but it's about delivery more than policy in many ways. Shared transport's in the mix, but not prominent enough from our point of view, but obviously in terms of the consultation, we'll be moving forward and trying to make that a bit better. Great thing is it's a 10-year plan, where previous NPFs have been 5-year plans, so I think that maybe sort of moves it a bit out of the political realm and more into policy, and hopefully gives consistency of delivery. Will it change the transport landscape? We certainly hope so. I think all these things coming together, NPF4, NTS2, STPR2, God, I love their acronyms, 20% car kilometre. There's a real momentum building around how we change the transport landscape. But I think as well, we've touched on it already, the issues around public transport in Scotland are still substantial. I think that's me this time. Yeah, thanks very much for listening. We'll move forward into some Q&A. If you want to put your hand up or pop a question in the chat box, that would be great. If you want some information on mobility hubs, it's there. You can join our quarterly forum and newsletter, and that's my email address there. And I will stop sharing and we'll see what's coming up. Right, gentlemen, thanks very much for that. Is there anything? Okay, we've got a few questions coming into the chat now. Matthew asked, how do you deal with developers who will say that the new planning requirements make development unviable and need to be relaxed if schemes are going to take place? David, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, that would be a good one for a local authority planner, because obviously they do have a lot. I mean, they do, a lot of pre-application discussion can take place, sometimes paid for by the developer with a local authority, and I guess the aim of the planner there is to try and make sure the best possible proposal comes forward. But yeah, I think Euan kind of touched on it. Is this play-off between a very sort of glossy development proposal that may end up going to planning committee? There was a big one in Stirling, I think, recently, whereby I think Professor Lee Sparks wrote about it, who deals with town centres, but it was, in his view, I probably would stay impartial. I have to stay impartial, but in Lee Sparks' view, very unsustainable out of town shopping development, which was, refused by, recommended for refusal within the planning department, but went to committee and was approved on the basis, I think, of job creation. And in some ways, that's the reality of planning. Like Euan touched on it, the policies are not legislation, and they're never going to be legislation. The planning legislation sets the framework. A former colleague of mine who'd worked in the private sector, I think said, planners could be more robust with consultants and saying, this is what we'd like you to do. And I think that can happen. And there are cases where I think planners do say, we will refuse that unless you do X, Y, or Z, and then you see applications that are withdrawn. I've not analysed when and how that happens, but I know it can happen. Yeah, Euan, is that something you'd want to comment on?
Yeah, viability, dark art. The comment I would make on it is, yes, the planners can be more robust, and a large-scale developer may not be able to make a 20% profit on it, and a landowner may get less for the land. It comes into much wider discussions which are sort of outside of the planning system around land value capture. And I suppose going back to, the Scottish Land Commission have made quite a lot of recommendations around deliverability of housing, around viability. And one of their strong recommendations was public-private partnerships, so that the public sector is helping de-risk certain sites. And I suppose certainly when it comes to vacant derelict land issues with contamination, there is certainly likely to be a need for public sector support for that. But it means that public and private sector would then both profit from the development. So there are different ways of approaching that. But when a developer just says it's not viable, developers used to say they could not supply affordable housing. And they said they couldn't supply it at a 10 to 15% rate of a development site. They're now being required to supply it at a 25% rate. It can be done. There will always be resistance. And I think, some of the things that I've been asked at previous sessions from people within the private sector is what we can do is like make your company do good things. And you can see that some of the large scale consultancies are taking, particularly around the carbon agenda, are saying they will not be involved in delivering things that they think aren't net zero or are damaging to the environment or climate. You will always have some bad apples. And as a result, you need a really well-resourced and well-equipped planning department and officer to be able to counter arguments that are presented around viability.
I think the local place plan gives communities the front foot to a certain extent, where they can tell developers within reason, obviously, that this is what they want and this is what they don't want. And it gives developers a framework to work to. I know I'm being optimistic here, don't get me wrong. But it gives developers a framework in which they can actually, understand their aspirations and the community's aspirations as well. And to a certain extent, it focuses the delivery rather than, you know, a developer deciding what they want to do and then forcing it upon the community. So I think that local place plan element can be a very important part of it, and I hope it's used in that way.
I'll maybe follow up on that, Mark, and like Laura, your question about community pitfalls, I could probably do a whole presentation on that, but maybe you might drop me an email to discuss that separately if you'd like. Sort of thing we look at. But on the local place plan issue, yeah, I mean, still an emerging landscape, but the Chief Planner, Fiona Simpson, and her evidence to the Local Government Planning Housing Committee, you know, I mean, I think, you know, mainlined local place plans as a consideration in planning decisions. And I think the circular that has emerged, and there's still government guidance to come out, is very much pushing local place plans. Well, it's not pushing, it's saying they're to be about use and development of land, and that is hardcore planning stuff. It acknowledges that any community engagement process, a lot of members of the community won't be differentiating between, is that a spatial planning matter, or is that a community development or a service delivery matter, which planning doesn't have power over. So like, I mean, whenever we do community engagement events in rural areas, the public transport issue that Euan touched on comes up. But I mean, there's only so much influence planning can have in that. Yeah, so I mean, I think unlike in England, neighbourhood plans are part of the local development plan, or the local plan as they call it in England. Here, as you saw in that diagram, they kind of sit out with the development plan, and it's been kept looser by Scottish Government. They're not examined, to my mind, in the same way as in England. So I think, that's what you say, Mark, you know, and as you know, if you're a clever developer, you should be looking at local place plan as part of your development proposal, and I hope they'll be quite mainlined alongside planning policy and guidance on local authority websites.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Well, amazingly, gentlemen, we're running out of time. It's 11:28. We're just about there. So there was one other question on the rural side of things from Hannah, but to be honest, I think we've touched on it about flexible guidelines around rural communities for 20-minute neighbourhoods. Thanks very much for your time. A lot of food for thought. I'd just like to say that Euan's popped the link to the SRA rural study in the chat. So if anybody wants to download that and have a look at it, I'd strongly recommend if the rural side of things is your bag, definitely have a look at that. And beyond that, I'd just like to say thanks very much to the panelists and to everybody that's attended. From my point of view, it's been very interesting, and I hope everybody's felt likewise. And we'll say thanks and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much, gentlemen.